like to acknowledge that the episodes in this series are produced on the traditional unceded lands of the Coast Salish peoples, which includes the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We thank them for allowing us to be their guests.
Companies, good or bad, once they're done with their work, what's left over?
Well, tailings are the Achilles heel of mining, and tailings are what's left over when the valuable stuff, as much as is possible to, has been removed. And so on a big mine, like maybe an open pit mine, you might want to think of something like that. There'll be tailings which have to be stored in a giant earthen dam. Usually they'll store it, and it's a liquid storage. It'll be stored with water, and precipitation will fall in. So it's like a giant pool. Mm-hmm. And quite often these structures need to be maintained in perpetuity, which is a problem, right? And then another big source of contamination on a mine site is just the waste rock. And what that is just, to get to the valuable metals, quite often you have to, they call it overburden, but quite often they have to move a lot of rock that's worthless, and it needs to go somewhere, so they'll store it. And precipitation drains through it, and when some of these sulfide minerals are exposed to air and water, it liberates contaminants, whether it's heavy metals and all these other things that are toxic in water. So there are these permanent liabilities on the site. So you can think of a big mine as, it's kind of this temporary source of valuable metals, but quite often it's a permanent toxic waste storage site. And forever is a word that publicly traded companies can't navigate.
Right.
So like it is a fiction to say that in 400 years, X company will be there to check the integrity of this tailings dam, or run this expensive water treatment plant that's making sure that the waste rock dump isn't leaching acid, contaminated water into the surrounding environment. Mm-hmm. And one of my favorite parts of the book actually deals with this aspect of forever in that context. And I was just going to read a tiny little bit from it.
Sure. Yeah.
Yucca Mountain was an attempt by the U.S. federal government to create a repository for nuclear waste, which currently is kind of stored all over the U.S. And the idea is to get it to a central place. That way, it's safer. It can be contained, less threat of someone stealing it, or everything like that. So, when the Yucca Mountain repository was planned in the early 1990s to store 70,000 tons of radioactive waste and plutonium in subterranean tunnels in Nevada, expected to remain dangerously toxic for 100,000 years, the U.S. Department of Energy convened a team of engineers, archaeologists, anthropologists, and linguists to design effective warning structures capable of lasting at least 10,000 years. Their challenge was to communicate the danger to future civilizations long after ours is gone. They proposed encircling the dump with 20-ton polished granite monuments patterned after Stonehenge and bearing thousands of small warning tablets inspired by the diorite stela inscribed with the laws of the 18th century BC Babylonian king Hammurabi. So assuming our current languages and cultures would no longer exist, the designers proposed using Munch's The Scream and the skull and crossbones as symbolic warnings. The punchline to this story was that when the US government convened a meeting of local indigenous groups to tell them about the plan to warn future generations about Yucca Mountain, the indigenous leaders found it outrageously funny. "Don't worry," one of the community members reportedly said. "We'll tell them where it is." And what this quote, and especially this response at the end, gets to is the absolute fundamental wisdom of indigenous people about place and environment and that sense of memory on the land, that which is, I find almost enviable, is just like, who from a settler culture could say that in 10,000 years that their culture would persist, or would and they take it as they have.
I sort of hope not.
Yeah, sure. Well, like the worst parts of it, but it's the story encapsulates why the Indigenous perspective is so important, and the Indigenous people across the global South will be, a lot of the metals we're going to need for the clean energy transition will be coming from the global South at a moment in time in history where Indigenous rights are ascendant in the world. And so a major bottleneck moving forward from us getting what we need is going to be the issue of social license. And social license, it's a term, it's jargon in industry, but everyone who has ever watched Avatar, the first Avatar movie, already knows what it is, because that movie is about the lack of social license. And so what happens is there's this mining outfit that lands on this planet, and there's this incredibly valuable mineral. They call it unobtainium.
Yes, right.
And so the Indigenous people don't want them there, and they don't want they don't want anything that this mining company can give them. And so what ends up happening inevitably, and so that is a tragedy of social license, right? Because what ends up happening is that the evil miners go in and blow up one of their sacred sites because there's a giant deposit of unobtainium there.
Yeah.
So people already know what social license is.